Evening. This is Cynthia Meese, Director of College Counseling at Wyoming High School. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I work with students whose last names are A through L. Mrs. Button is the other college counselor, and she works with last names M through Z. She's behind the scenes this evening, kind of manning the back end of things. So tonight, if you are just joining us, we have with us Rayanne DiBaggio. She is a senior associate director at Case Western University. She's been there for 26 years. Rayanne and I go way back, and it's nice to see her. She is going to talk to us about test optional admissions, which we know for many of you is kind of a hot topic. What exactly does that mean? Is it really optional? All of those things. So I will let Rayanne take it away, and then we will leave time at the end for questions.
Thank you, Cynthia. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all having a good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this and to talk about a topic that I know is really important part of those of you who are in the college search process, the application process. And it's really kind of become a hot topic, especially in the past couple of years, as COVID has taken over and changed the way that we are doing things in the college admissions world. So I thought what might be helpful is to start with a little bit of background information first about test optional and sort of how we have gotten to where we are today in the college admission world. So prior to COVID, there was a test optional movement that really had started to take hold among colleges and universities. And then COVID and this pandemic hit. And so it kind of changed everything that we knew in the college admission world and the way that we had previously done testing and college admission and reviews of applications and those kinds of things. And so, the pandemic caused nearly every college and university to go test optional. Some went test blind, some went test optional. So let me start there with sort of defining what those two terms mean. So test optional means that testing is not required, and that typically refers to SAT or ACT testing. It doesn't refer to AP testing, those types of things. Test blind is that schools will not accept testing at all as part of the college admission experience. So a test optional school will allow you the opportunity to take those tests, see what your scores look like, and then determine if you would like to submit them as an optional piece of your application. A test blind school will not take them. They won't become a part of your application materials at all. In 2 years ago, we were all kind of scrambling because test sites were canceling, test dates were canceling, students didn't have access to take those tests. And so it became evident very quickly that testing was not going to be an option for a lot of students, and you wouldn't be able to supply that information as part of your admission application. So, currently this year, there are about 1,800 colleges and universities around the country that are test optional. There are about 1,400 that are signed on for at least next year or beyond, and that list continues to grow. Fairtest.org is a great website for you to reference. They keep a very current list of all the colleges and universities that are test optional and have some great resources as you're trying to determine whether that is a good fit for you. Schools like Harvard have recently announced that beyond 2026 and perhaps beyond, they've made a commitment to be test optional as well. So this is a growing movement that we continue to expect will even become larger with the number of schools that are doing that. You now have several large public school systems around the country that are in the process of permanently adopting test optional as well. So it's a huge movement that continues to grow and is something that you should think about as you are getting ready to embark upon this college admission application process. So for the fall of 2021, and kind of to a lesser degree for the fall of 2022, the decision to apply test optional, could have been influenced by test availability. You may have been scheduled to take some tests, but not have a lot of opportunities to take as many as you would like to take. So you're not sure that those test results would be an accurate reflection of your abilities and that what you're communicating to colleges and universities. But most likely for fall of 23 and beyond, that's really not going to be an issue anymore, because that availability and that access has kind of come back full circle, and students have that readily available. What is changing now is that it really now becomes a choice as to whether or not students want to spend time preparing for and taking those tests. And then when you do take them, whether you feel those test scores are an accurate reflection of your ability and how you think they may help you in the college application or to a specific school or program. So what you might want to do is think about what test optional means to you in this process. So is it that the school that you are applying to is test optional for admission? Is it to the entire school? Is it to certain programs? Are there certain programs that even if the school is test optional, they want test scores because of the competitive nature of the admission process into those programs? Or is it a school that says, we are not interested in seeing those test scores for any program, whatever you apply to. If you're admitted to the university, then we will use that without asking for test scores. It could be that the admission process is test optional, but scholarships or specialty types of programs may require some additional testing. So it may be that you want to take those tests, have them kind of there and accessible, because you don't know at this point, or when you're registering for those tests, you don't know what your search process is going to look like, what the list of schools are going to look like, and if you are going to need those test scores for some reason throughout that process. It may also mean that you are applying for some external types of scholarships, so perhaps some local types of things or national scholarships. And one of the criteria for that application process is going to be submitting test scores. So it's better for you to have them and not use them than to be scrambling if you find that you need them later in this process and discover that you may have missed a deadline or you're not able to provide information that you might need as part of that. It's possible that you can take them, obviously, and see how you do on them. And then it's worth having a conversation with your college counselor to see how you think those scores will fit into your admission application process. So do you think that they're an accurate reflection? Some students are very strong test takers. Some students are not strong test takers. So after you have those scores in hand, having that conversation can also be an important part of that college search and that application process. So it may be that you have a very strong application. So the strength of your high school courses, the rigor of those courses, a transcript is a much better indicator of a student's ability over that 4 years. We get to see where a student started as a high school freshman and where they've progressed through their senior coursework. So, how have those courses changed in the rigor and the availability? How well are you doing in those classes? How are you prepared for those courses? If you're taking APs and you're scoring well on those APs, it may be that even if you apply test optional, you're submitting those AP scores so that, that's one more piece of information that schools have to substantiate your academic ability, that, nationally you're scoring at this level. And we know that AP classes around the country are taught at the same level, whether you take them in Ohio, Florida, California, or anywhere else in the US. They have to meet specific standards. So as we're looking at those, we know what the content of those classes are. We know how students are doing in those classes. And so that transcript, that academic 4-year history becomes a very important part. It's always been an important part of the admission process. But when you're choosing to apply as a test optional student, if we don't have testing, then that becomes an even more important part for us to see that you've challenged yourself, you've done well in those courses, and that you are prepared for the program that you're applying to, or in the case of a student who's applying to a school that's admission to the college or the university, not to a specific program, that regardless of what you might choose, we feel comfortable and confident that you have prepared yourself and can be successful and be a competitive student who will contribute in the classroom, in discussions, who can work well collaboratively and independently in the classroom. So sitting for those tests, having those scores, then having a well-informed conversation with your college counselor would be a great way to start. And as you're putting your college list together, determining if schools are test optional, if they're test blind, and then how those test scores might help you positively or perhaps not as positively in comparison to that academic transcript and the courses that we're going to see as part of that. As schools have moved to test optional, there have been some other things that have come into play and may be a little bit more, have a little bit more emphasis on them. So I mentioned before that the way that we really can get a sense of you academically is that 4-year academic history on your transcript. But you may find that there are some additional requirements now. If you're choosing to be a test optional student, maybe you need additional letters of recommendation, or maybe you need to write an additional essay, or perhaps the school will ask you for a submitted, graded assignment of some sort, or writing paper or something like that. So, that could be that there are going to be additional pieces that become a part of the application required documents to help us get a sense of you as a student, to provide that additional insight into you in your performance in and out of the classroom in those classes. Just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective, for example, at Case Western Reserve University, we have committed to be test optional through the class of 2023, and then we are reviewing that. So we went on a 3-year test optional when all of this started. So we have 1 year of historical information to look at. So not sure how that's going to change or how that's going to play out in this year's class, but last year we had about 32,000 applications to the university. 41% of the students that we admitted to Case Western last year were test optional. So a large number of our students were applying and were admissible to the university as part of that. So, admission offices have adjusted to this test optional world. We are reading applications. We've always been holistic. We've always paid very close attention to all the different pieces and parts to learn about students individually and what they will bring to our institutions, how they'll contribute in the classroom and outside of the classroom in the living and the learning communities. So I think that's probably a good place to stop, and then to see if there are any specific questions that families have that we can talk a little bit more about.
So I have a question that I'm not seeing in the chat, but I know that everybody's thinking this. So is test optional really optional? You've got 2 students, the same academic record. One submits a standardized test score, one doesn't. In the back of your head, as an admission officer, are you ever like, oh, that student didn't submit their score because it's a 21? Or if it was good, they would have said, right? So how do you work through that?
So test optional really means test optional. And we are not comparing. I mean, for example, I spent the entire day today reading applications, and I saw applications that had test scores. I saw applications that didn't have test scores. And so I'm not approaching that thinking, okay, this student did, this student didn't. We're not comparing, student to student. We're looking at you individually. So, you're being reviewed on a number of different things. It could be, within the pool of students who are applying for specific programs. And so what is the competition level there? It's about that academic preparation. And so, the courses that you've taken, are you prepared for the types of classes that you are going to encounter as a first-year student or throughout the 4 years that you would be in the program of study? So do you have the right classes, and what kind of grades have you earned in those classes? So if a student chooses to submit those test scores, it's one more piece of information, but it's not something that you're being held at a disadvantage to because you don't have that. So we're looking at each student individually, the materials that they are providing, and using that to make a well-informed decision. So, things like recommendation letters help us get a sense of you in the classroom. Are you somebody who contributes? So are you somebody who we think will ask questions if you have questions about the content in the class? Coupling that with the courses you've taken and how you've performed in those courses. So there are a lot of other indicators that we can look at that help us get a good sense of you as a student and your preparation. And as I mentioned, 41% of our students didn't have test scores and were very admissible to the university and were strong candidates that, we felt comfortable and confident, were prepared, would come in, would be contributors, and would do well in our incoming freshman class.
So this is a really good question that just popped up, and it is, do you know what percentage of test optional freshmen returned as sophomores? Are you seeing anything there that?
That's a really great question. And I don't know that there's enough data that's been collected yet, because most schools are just in their first year of students, the majority of us who were not test optional prior to the pandemic. So for those of us who kind of pivoted very quickly 2 years ago, our first class are freshmen on our campuses. So we won't have any of that information until we have the census and see the students that are coming back next year. For schools that have been historically test optional, it's going to depend. And I think you're going to find that that's, while it kind of feels like it's a cop-out answer, it depends is really very true. So as you're looking at schools, as you're visiting schools, as you're reaching out to admission offices, I think that's a great question to ask each school, and each school is going to have a different answer, but they should be able to tell you what the overall retention rate is, and they may have that. You also may find that on institution websites. So all of us collect data in our institutional research offices. Many of us put together information that is available to the general public. So you may be able to find that there, in the data that's collected in terms of how many students apply, how many were admitted, what the average scores might have been, those types of things. So I think it's something that you can get, but I don't know that there's an easy one place location for you to find out about every school that you're looking at.
We have another question, and it is, how do students know if a score is good enough to submit?
So I think you'll find, especially for schools that are test optional, we still will put general information on our website. So kind of the profile on the admission website of what our applicant pool looked like. So you'll find kind of the middle 50% of students who were admissible. So you'll see what those test score ranges are. So for students who chose to submit testing, we have that data, and we've averaged that, so we can give you a range that, this number to this number on the SAT was the middle 50% of the students that we admitted. This number to this number was the middle 50% on the ACT that we've admitted. So when you look at those middle 50%, you have to keep in mind that a quarter of the class that were admitted scored higher than that, and a quarter of the class that were admitted scored lower than that. So I think if you look at where your test score might fall in that range, that will help you get a sense of, am I in that top quarter? Am I in that middle 50? Am I in that lower quarter? And then having that information on top of having a conversation with your college counselor, they can help put that in perspective as well, because there might be other things that, depending on the program that you're interested in, their knowledge of the school to know that, hey, that program is the most competitive program. So even though you're in the middle 50, it might be better for you to be in the top quarter because of the competition to be admitted. Or, the opposite might be true. Or maybe it's a conversation that you have that based on your score and the competitive nature of that school, maybe it's better for you to be a test optional. But that's a conversation that you can have in partnership with your counselor, and they're going to be able to really give you some good advice on what route would be best for you. And you can be test optional at one school and not necessarily be test optional at another school. So, each school is going to be a little bit different. Each school's admission numbers and kind of the admission profile is going to be a little different. So it really is about that kind of that two-way conversation as you're putting the list together to have so that you have a good sense of what's going to be the best option for you with each of the schools you're planning to apply to.
All right. So I think we have time for one more question before we have to end you and move on to our next panelist. And that is, how much weight, if a student does not submit ACT or SAT, but chooses to submit AP scores in lieu of ACT or SAT, how much weight does that hold? How helpful is that?
So those scores can be helpful to just so that we can get a sense of how you did in that class. So you took the AP class, but then that score helps us get a sense of, how well you retained and what you really learned in that class. So again, it's up to you to decide. So there's art and there's science to the admission process. So, we're looking at that. If you feel comfortable and confident in those scores, again, having a conversation, because 3, 4s, and 5s mean different things at schools. So some schools, they're all going to be treated equally. Some schools, 4s and 5s are going to get you credit. So if you look at individual admission websites, you will find links to information about AP scores. So for example, on our website, we have a list of all the AP exams and the scores that we require to give you college credit. So generally, a 4 or a 5 is going to earn you college credit with us. So a 4 or a 5 is it's strong enough to get you college credit with us. That doesn't mean that if you get a 3, we don't think that you've performed and done well. It just means that we wouldn't give you college credit for it. But other schools, you may do that. So again, having a conversation with your counselor who's more familiar with the school, who's familiar with your curriculum and what students are doing in those classes and how that may translate into the admission process can go hand in hand with whether or not you want to be completely test optional, you want to be partially test optional, or you want to send your scores, all or some of your scores in as part of the admission process.
Great. I think you've covered it all. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And if students have additional questions that we can't answer, we'll be sure to reach out to you for that information and pass that on. But
sounds great.
Thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully I will see you in person soon.
Hopefully. Thanks for inviting me.
Here.
Good luck with your process, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.